Ryan's office revenge.
22 million. That's what I told Brad Hoffman at Jim Wheeler's retirement party, and I've never seen a man's face go through so many colors so fast. Like watching a neon sign short circuit in real time. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up and tell you how a 49-year-old plant supervisor from Ohio ended up saying those words to his boss in front of half the factory floor. My name's Harold Peterson, but everyone calls me Hank. I've been keeping Consolidated Manufacturing running for 18 years. Ever since I got out of the Navy and decided I'd had enough of being told what to do by people who'd never actually fixed anything with their hands. Before that, I spent 8 years on destroyers learning that when systems fail at sea, people die. Not exactly the kind of lesson you forget when you're dealing with industrial equipment that could crush a man without even slowing down. I live in Akron with my wife Susan and our 2 kids. Well, they're not kids anymore. Tommy's 22, finishing up his mechanical engineering degree at Ohio State, and Sarah's 19, studying business at Miami University. Between tuition payments and the mortgage on a house that's worth less than what we owe on it, money's been tight for longer than I care to admit. Susan works part-time at the credit union, but her hours got cut last year when they automated half the teller operations. Funny how that keeps happening everywhere you look. The plant sits on the east side of town, one of those sprawling brick buildings that used to employ half the neighborhood back when America actually made things. We manufacture aluminum housings for automotive components. Not glamorous, but steady work that pays decent wages if you don't mind the noise and the heat. At least it used to be steady. These days, every quarterly meeting comes with rumors about moving production to Mexico or shutting down entirely. Corporate keeps talking about optimization and efficiency improvements, which is executive speak for how. Can we make the same stuff with fewer people? Brad Hoffman became our plant manager 3 years ago, fresh out of some MBA program and full of ideas about lean manufacturing and synergistic solutions. He's 37 years old, which means he was in middle school when I was learning how to keep a ship's engine running in 12-foot seas. Not that experience seems to count for much around here anymore. Brad's got the kind of confidence that only comes from never having been really wrong about something important. The kind of guy who thinks a PowerPoint presentation can solve any problem. I sit 3 stations down from his office, close enough to hear him on conference calls with corporate, talking about metrics and KP as like they're magic spells that'll somehow fix our broken monitoring systems and outdated equipment. Far enough away that he only notices me when something breaks and needs fixing right now. That's been my job for 18 years, the guy who makes problems disappear so management can pretend everything's running smooth. When Line 2's conveyor system starts making that grinding noise that means a bearing's about to seize, I'm the one crawling under the machinery with a flashlight and a grease gun. When the quality control computer crashes and takes our production data with it, I'm the one who rebuilds the database from backup files that haven't been updated since Obama was president. I learned a long time ago that being indispensable and being valued are 2 completely different things. Indispensable means they can't afford to fire you. Valued means they listen when you try to tell them how to keep problems from happening in the first place. The thing about working in a plant is that you develop an instinct for trouble, a hydraulic line that's starting to weep, a temperature sensor that's reading a degree off, a safety interlock that's taking just a fraction of a second too long to engage. After enough years of watching expensive equipment destroy itself because someone ignored the warning signs, you start seeing patterns everywhere. Our quality monitoring system had been showing warning signs for about 5 years. The thing was a nightmare of mismatched equipment from different vendors, cobbled together by whoever had the lowest bid on the original installation. Half the sensors were older than Tommy, and the software that tied it all together looked like it had been written by a committee of people who'd never actually worked on a factory floor. When something went wrong, and something went wrong about twice a week, it took 20 minutes of checking different screens just to figure out which station had the problem. By that time, we'd usually produced hundreds of defective parts that had to be scrapped, which meant explaining to very unhappy customers why their shipments were going to be late. I'd been thinking about this problem for years, sketching ideas on napkins during lunch breaks, wondering why nobody made a monitoring system that actually worked the way people needed it to work. But thinking about problems and being able to do something about them are different things entirely. The moment that changed everything happened on a Tuesday night in July 2019. I was at home, helping Sarah with her college application essays and trying not to think about how we were going to pay for another kid in school when my phone rang. Night shift supervisor, panic in his voice. "Hank, we got a situation. Line 3's been running hot for who knows how long, and we just caught it. Temperature sensor never triggered the alarm." I drove to the plant doing 20 over the speed limit, knowing exactly what I was going to find. The aluminum housings had been cooking in overheated molds for at least 45 minutes, maybe longer. 12,000 parts, completely out of spec, looking like they'd been made from melted butter. The whole batch had to be scrapped. $80,000 of aluminum and machine time gone, plus the cost of explaining to Ford why their Thursday delivery was going to be the following Tuesday instead. Brad called an all-hands meeting the next morning, stood there in his safety vest that had never seen actual safety hazards, talking about accountability and communication like he'd just discovered these concepts. "We need better systems," he announced to a room full of people who'd been saying exactly that for years. "More integration, better visibility, moving forward." I raised my hand, kept it calm, professional. I've been thinking about this exact problem for a while. I could design an integrated monitoring system that would catch something like this before it becomes a disaster. Tie all our sensors together, give us one dashboard, real-time alerts. Brad smiled, that practice smile he used when he wanted to shut someone down without looking like he was being rude. "Let's stay focused on proven solutions, Hank. I appreciate the initiative, but we need enterprise-level thinking here. I'm going to reach out to some consultants who specialize in this kind of system integration." He never asked what experience I had with control systems, never asked what I'd learned in the Navy about integrated monitoring, never asked if I'd already started sketching out a design. He just smiled and moved on to talking about bringing in experts from Cincinnati or Detroit, people who'd charge us $200,000 to tell us what our problems were, and another $500,000 to maybe fix them. After that meeting, I sat in my truck for 15 minutes, staring at the steering wheel and thinking about the $80,000 we'd just lost. About the overtime hours I'd worked for free over the years, staying late to fix problems that could have been prevented. About the raises that never came and the promotions that went to people with degrees instead of experience. But mostly I thought about Susan, working extra shifts at the credit union to help cover Sarah's textbooks, and Tommy eating ramen noodles in his dorm room because we couldn't afford to put more money on his meal plan. I thought about the second mortgage we'd taken out to pay for his first 2 years of school, and how we were going to manage Sarah's tuition on top of that. You know that feeling when you realize someone is so used to not listening to you that they can't hear you even when you're making perfect sense? I was past frustrated. It felt clinical, like watching someone touch a hot stove over and over, convinced they were doing something smart. 3 days later, I started building the system anyway. Not for them, for me. Because I was tired of watching preventable problems become expensive disasters, and because I needed to do something that felt like progress instead of just maintaining someone else's mistakes. I set up a workbench in my garage, right next to where I restore old motorcycles. Started with a basic PLC setup, programmable logic controller, the kind every manufacturing guy knows how to work with. Used my own money to buy used. Sensors and processors, staying up until 2 a.m. on weeknights, writing code and testing circuits while Susan watched Netflix in the living room and pretended not to worry about me. The first version was just a proof of concept. Connect a dozen sensors, monitor them all on one screen, set up alerts that actually meant something. But once I got it working, I couldn't stop improving it. This thing was going to work the way it should have worked from the beginning. I added predictive analytics that could spot bearing wear before failure. Integrated inventory tracking so it could automatically adjust production when we were running low on materials. Built-in quality trending that could catch drift problems before they produced bad parts. Called it the Plant Intelligence System, PIS for short, which made me smile every time Brad complained about our piss-poor quality numbers. The beauty of working on your own project is that you can do things right instead of doing them cheap. Every component I selected actually worked with the other components. Every piece of software talked to every other piece of software. No vendor lock-in, no proprietary interfaces that would force us to buy overpriced upgrades every 2 years. By the end of the first year, it was better than anything we had on the plant floor. By the end of the second year, it was better than anything I'd seen at the trade shows. And I kept it completely separate from company systems. Used my own computer, my own sensors, my own cloud storage, documented everything, kept receipts, made sure there was no question about who built what and when. Susan started calling it Hank's midnight hobby, but she could see it was more than that. This wasn't just tinkering, this was engineering. real problem solving that might actually lead somewhere. She'd bring me coffee around 11 p.m. and look over my shoulder at the screens full of data flowing in real time. "Think it'll work?" she asked one night, watching me test a new algorithm that could predict conveyor belt failures 3 days in advance. "It already works," I said. "Question is whether anyone's going to care." Meanwhile, work continued as usual. Brad made his rounds, talking about continuous improvement and operational excellence like he'd invented the concepts. The consultants came through every 6 months with their clipboards and recommendations, charging us more for a week of meetings than I made in a year. Younger engineers got promoted for suggesting things I'd been doing quietly for a decade. The corporate efficiency experts loved to show us charts about productivity metrics and benchmark comparisons. What they didn't show us were the charts about how much money we were hemorrhaging every time our monitoring system failed to catch a problem before it became a crisis, or how much we could save if we actually fixed the underlying issues instead of just cleaning up the messes afterward. I watched Brad present quarterly reports to corporate, taking credit for safety improvements that came directly from modifications I'd made to our lockout procedures. Watched him celebrate cost savings that resulted from process changes I'd suggested and he'd initially ignored. Watched him get promoted to regional supervisor while I stayed exactly where I'd been for the past 5 years. But I also watched our system fail in exactly the ways I'd predicted, and I documented every failure. Temperature sensor malfunctions that could have been caught with proper diagnostics. Quality drift that went unnoticed for hours because nobody was watching the right indicators. Production delays that cost us customer contracts because we couldn't respond fast enough to changing conditions. Every problem became a feature in my system. Every failure became a case study in why integrated monitoring mattered. By year 3, I had a solution that would have prevented every major production issue we'd experienced in the past decade, and still I said nothing. Not because I was scared, but because I knew how this place worked. If I demoed my system, Brad would either ignore it again or worse, find a way to claim it as company property and take credit for the innovation. I'd seen it happen before with other people's ideas. So I kept it off the company network, kept detailed logs of every development hour, every component purchase, every breakthrough. Built a folder labeled intellectual property documentation and stored everything in third-party cloud services that had nothing to do with consolidated manufacturing. I wasn't being paranoid, I was being careful. Because the one thing Navy training teaches you is that preparation and documentation can save your life when everything goes sideways. The breakthrough came in early 2023, at the worst possible time. Tommy had just started his senior year, and Sarah was looking at graduate programs that cost more per semester than Susan and I made together in 6 months. The plant was running mandatory overtime to meet a contract deadline, which meant 12-hour shifts 6 days a week and no time for anything except work and sleep. I was at the Manufacturing Technology Expo in Chicago, using 3 vacation days I couldn't really afford to take when everything changed. Susan had wanted me to skip it this year. We needed the money more than I needed to look at equipment we'd never be able to afford. But something told me I needed to be there, walking those aisles and seeing what other people were building to solve the same problems we dealt with every day. The expo floor was packed with vendors showing off their latest monitoring systems, each one promising to revolutionize manufacturing operations. Most of it was marketing nonsense, fancy displays and buzzword presentations that looked impressive but wouldn't last a month in a real factory environment. I'd been doing this long enough to tell the difference between equipment that worked and equipment that sold. I was about to head home early when I stopped at a booth for Industrial Solutions Group. They were demonstrating their latest quality monitoring platform, and it looked exactly like what I'd been building in my garage, except mine was better. The technical director was a guy named Mike Santos, maybe 45 years old, with the kind of hands that told you he'd actually worked on factory floors before he moved into management. We started talking about integration challenges and sensor reliability, and I mentioned some of the solutions I'd developed for common problems. "You work for a systems integrator?" he asked. "No, just a plant supervisor who got tired of watching preventable problems become expensive disasters." His eyes lit up. "You built something yourself?" I showed him some pictures on my phone, my garage setup, the control interface, real-time data from a simulation I'd been running. His expression changed from polite interest to genuine excitement. "This is exactly what we've been trying to develop for 2 years, he said. "Our clients are screaming for integrated monitoring that actually works in real industrial environments." Would you be willing to demo this? 3 weeks later, Mike and 2 of his engineers were sitting in my garage, watching my system run a complete production scenario. 24 sensors, 3 simulated production lines, real-time quality monitoring, predictive maintenance alerts, automatic production optimization, all running on equipment that cost less than what most companies spent on conference room furniture. You built this alone? One of the engineers asked, staring at the screens full of flowing data. Nights and weekends for the past 4 years, I said. Started after we had a major quality failure that could have been prevented with proper monitoring. Mike leaned back in his chair, looking around my garage at the organized chaos of sensors, controllers, and test equipment. Hank, we don't just want to buy this technology, we want to license it, bring you on as a technical consultant, and help you file patents on the key innovations. I'd been expecting maybe a small consulting contract, something that might help with Tommy's last semester expenses. I wasn't expecting a licensing deal that could change everything. The negotiations took 6 months. Industrial Solutions Group handled all the legal work, and they did it right. Patents filed on 14 different innovations. Licensing agreements that guaranteed me a percentage of every system they sold. Consulting contract that paid more per month than I made at the plant. And the beautiful thing was that I'd done everything completely clean. Used my own time, my own materials, my own expertise. The only thing Consolidated Manufacturing had contributed was inspiring me to solve problems they couldn't see. The documentation I'd been keeping for 4 years proved everything. Time-stamped photos of every development stage. Receipts for every component purchase. Cloud storage. Logs showing exactly when each version was created and by whom. Even video recordings of early tests, dated and geotagged from my garage. When Industrial Solutions Group's lawyers reviewed everything, they said it was the cleanest intellectual property chain they'd ever seen. No question of ownership, no possibility of corporate interference. It was mine, completely and legally. The first pilot installation went live at a Ford supplier in Michigan in December 2023. 0 integration problems, immediate return on investment, safety improvements that made the insurance company so happy they reduced the plant's premiums by 15%. By February, Industrial Solutions Group had orders from 3 major automotive plants and 2 aerospace manufacturers. My system worked exactly like I'd designed it to work. No vendor lock-in, no proprietary interfaces, no planned obsolescence. Just solid engineering that solved real problems for real people doing real work. The trade magazines started calling it revolutionary. Manufacturing Week ran a cover story about the blue-collar innovation revolution. Modern Manufacturing featured my garage lab in a photo spread about grassroots engineering, and my name was on every patent, every technical document, every case study they published. Back at Consolidated, we were still dealing with the same monitoring problems we'd had for years. Still losing production time to sensor failures we should have seen coming. Still scrapping parts because our quality system couldn't keep up with our production pace. Still explaining to unhappy customers why their deliveries were going to be late. I could have fixed it all in about a week, but nobody had asked. Brad was too busy implementing recommendations from the latest round of consultants, who'd charged us $150,000 to suggest changes that would save us maybe $30,000 per year if everything went perfectly. I watched him present these consulting recommendations to corporate like they were his own ideas. Watched him take credit for minor efficiency improvements while our major systemic problems continued to cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars every quarter. But I also watched the trade publications and industry forums, watched companies implementing my technology and reporting results that made their competitors take notice, watched my licensing payments grow every month as more plants adopted the system. Susan started handling our finances differently. Instead of arguing about whether we could afford Sarah's textbook expenses, she was talking about paying off the second mortgage early. Instead of worrying about Tommy's graduation costs, she was researching graduate programs for Sarah. "You realize this changes everything," she said one evening, looking at the latest licensing check. "It changes some things," I said. "Doesn't change the fact that I still have a job to do." But it did change how I felt about that job. I went to work every morning knowing that I had options, that I didn't have to stay invisible forever if I didn't want to. I fixed Brad's broken systems and solved his recurring problems, but I wasn't doing it out of desperation anymore. I was doing it out of professional pride. The retirement party was for Jim Wheeler, our maintenance supervisor for 23 years. Good man, taught me half of what I know about hydraulics, deserved a proper send-off after keeping our equipment running long past its intended lifespan. They set it up in the main break room with sheet cake from the grocery store, coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long, and the usual decorations they dragged out for these occasions. I grabbed a beer from the cooler they'd brought in special for the occasion and found a spot near the back, next to the bulletin board where they posted safety statistics and overtime schedules. Most of the day shift was there, along with some guys from maintenance and quality control. Even a few people from the front office had wandered down, probably because free food and beer beats sitting in cubicles pretending to work. Brad was already working the room, shaking hands and making small talk like a politician running for mayor of the plant floor. He had that practiced enthusiasm he always brought to company events, the kind that looked genuine unless you'd seen it enough times to notice the pattern. "Jim's been the backbone of our maintenance operations," Brad said when he called for everyone's attention. "The kind of employee who makes this place work, dedicated, reliable, always ready to tackle the tough problems." There was polite applause. A few guys whistled. Someone made a joke about Jim finally getting to sleep past 5 a.m. on weekdays. All the usual retirement party ritual. I was finishing my beer when Steve Rodriguez, one of the shift supervisors, wandered over with that slightly loose grin that comes with drinking beer at 3 in the afternoon. "You still messing around with that computer stuff in your garage?" he asked. I smiled. "Not anymore." He laughed, loud and loose. "What, it finally exploded? Man, I told you that thing was going to be more trouble than it was worth. Should have spent that time working on your Harley instead." "No," I said, calm and clear. "I sold it." Steve stopped mid-laugh, looking at me like I'd started speaking in tongues. "Wait, what?" The words weren't loud. I didn't raise my voice or make a scene. Just said them like I was confirming the weather forecast. But they were loud enough for the conversation around us to pause. Loud enough for Brad, standing about 8 feet away and basking in post-speech attention, to turn his head and focus on what I was saying. "I sold it," I repeated, meeting his eyes. "Sold what?" Steve asked, blinking hard like proximity might make the words make more sense. "The monitoring system. To Industrial Solutions Group." Now I had Brad's full attention. The fake smile he'd been wearing all evening flickered and died. His mouth opened, slightly, closed, opened again. Like his brain was trying to process information that didn't fit with his understanding of the world. "How much?" he asked, voice tight and careful. I looked straight at him, steady, calm, the way you deliver news that can't be taken back. 22 million. You could feel it. Not just the silence, but the air itself seemed to stop moving. Steve's beer can slipped from his hand and hit the linoleum floor with a metallic clang that echoed in the sudden quiet. A couple other guys turned to see what the noise was about, then stayed turned when they saw everyone staring at me. Brad's face went through 3 different expressions in about 2 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been panic. "You're kidding," he said, but his voice suggested he already knew I wasn't. "Nope," I said. "Signed the licensing deal last month. They're already installing the system at Ford plants in Michigan and Kentucky. Caterpillar's testing it for their heavy equipment division." The realization spread through the room like spilled hydraulic fluid. The guy who'd been fixing their broken equipment for 18 years had been quietly building the future in his garage. The supervisor they treated like just another wrench turner had just become wealthy enough to buy the whole plant and turn it into a parking lot if he wanted to. I could see it in their faces. The questions forming, the mental calculations, the sudden understanding that they'd been working next to someone who was solving problems they didn't even know existed. Someone who'd been documenting their failures and building solutions while they argued about overtime schedules and break room coffee quality. Carol Jensen from Quality Control had stopped mid-conversation across the room. Linda Hoffman from HR was staring at me like I'd just announced I was an alien who'd been studying human behavior for the past 2 decades. Even Jim Wheeler, the guy whose party this was supposed to be, was looking at me with new interest. "You built that while working here?" Brad asked, and I could hear the worry creeping into his voice. The sudden awareness that there might be legal implications he hadn't considered. "On my own time with my own equipment," I said. "I documented everything. Timestamps, receipts, development logs. Want to see the patent filings?" He opened his mouth like he had more questions, but nothing came out. Because there was nothing to say. I'd done it clean, and he knew it. More than that, he was starting to remember all the times I'd tried to tell him about problems he didn't want to hear about. all the solutions he'd dismissed without bothering to understand them. "Why didn't you bring it to us first?" he finally managed, and I almost felt sorry for him. "I did," I said. July 2019. After the Line 3 meltdown cost us $80,000 in a customer contract, you said we needed enterprise-level thinking. The color drained from his face as he remembered that meeting. Remembered telling me to stay focused on proven solutions while he waited for consultants to tell him what I'd already figured out. I set my empty beer can on the nearest table and picked up my jacket. "Congratulations on your retirement, Jim," I called across the room. "You earned it." Then I walked toward the exit, leaving behind 18 years of being the guy who fixed things without getting credit, the guy who knew how to solve problems but was never asked for solutions, the guy who'd built the future while they managed the present into the ground. As I reached the door, I heard Steve talking to someone behind me. 22 million, he was saying, like he still couldn't process the number. Hank just made $22 million. I stepped out into the parking lot, breathing cool evening air and feeling lighter than I had in years. Not because of the money, though that was nice. Not because I'd proven anything to anyone, though I suppose I had. But because I'd finally demonstrated something I'd known all along. That experience and craftsmanship still matter, even in a world that thinks everything valuable has to come from corporate consultants and enterprise-level solutions. My truck started on the first try, just like it had every day for the past 12 years. As I drove home through neighborhoods where people worked hard for steady paychecks and worried about their kids' futures, I thought about all the problems that could be solved if people just listened to the guys who actually knew how things worked. Tomorrow, Brad would start wondering how many other solutions I might have developed if he'd bothered to ask. He'd realize that dismissing experience in favor of credentials had cost him more than just money. It had cost him the chance to be part of something innovative instead of just managing someone else's mediocrity. But tonight, I was going home to tell Susan that we could pay off both mortgages, that Tommy could go to graduate school if he wanted, that Sarah could study whatever she loved without worrying about the cost. Tonight, I was going home to my garage, where a rebuilt Harley was waiting for me to finish what I'd started, and where the workbench that had changed our lives was ready for the next project that nobody else thought was worth building. Sometimes the biggest innovations come from the people who've been quietly solving problems while everyone else was looking for someone to blame. They say experience can't be taught. Turns out it can't be ignored forever either.